All right, guys, we're back for day 3. How's the audio? Anybody on? Let me know how the audio is. Audio is good. All right, perfect. So we're going to do it back out here on the in the cabana again. Yesterday's was pretty good. We had Evan Silva and Bill Krakenberger. Before we bring on Scott Barrett, what I'm going to do is go ahead and open it up to some initial questions, but I am going to talk a little bit about Crack. So Crack left. He went back to Vegas. He actually drove up to Baltimore, got up at like 2 a.m., drove up to Baltimore. Hey, what's up, Ben? Drove up to Baltimore, took a flight at like 8 a.m. back out to Vegas. He's getting down on the Floyd fight. He's hanging out there. Pretty much, Crack doesn't leave Vegas for most of the season. So during football time, that's his busiest time. He'll make trips. He'll do some things during the summer and that sort of thing. Come back to the East Coast. But during football season, he's in Vegas and he's getting numbers and he's looking at all the different outs that he can get out there. Some background on he and I, we've been working together for a number of years now. How long have I been doing this? I've had 11 seasons on the books. This is my 12th season that I've been doing this. Now I've gotten more and more serious over time. At first, when I first started, it was just trying to get in the door, kick down the door. I was posting stuff on forums. I was just trying to do as much as I could to get games out there for people to look at and to see that I was able to forecast and prognosticate the NFL and college football well. After a while, I started getting noticed. Crack was one of the first guys to notice me, and then I started working for some of these guys. I worked for a number of these professional betting groups. You could call them syndicate groups. You could call them what have you. Most are in Vegas. Some are offshore, and I provide them with information. I provide them with games. I also, a lot of the bookmakers. If you see my 2017 NFL preview, you'll see that a number of bookmakers are obviously familiar with me as well. Post the team total analysis. Oh yeah, that's right. So I was talking to Evan Silva about this. I think we're going to run an article on Roto World about totals in the NFL. Yeah, like the games that go over. See, far too many people in DFS. I love DFS, but there's, if you caught the show yesterday, the analysis that we were talking about with misreading Vegas lines and misunderstanding exactly the sharp money and where it's going and what you should do for DFS, that is a real problem. A lot of people are talking in the DFS community as if they're very confident about that. And the reality is they probably should be a little bit less confident that they think they are. But with regard to the totals, it's the same thing as sides. You could see a high total, but just because the total is high, you don't want to just pick guys in high totals. You want to analyze the matchups and use the total as a guide, but remember that there are people like me and myself, obviously, who are betting unders in these games because we don't think the game's going to be as high scoring. Now, I'm not telling you, say the game's 52, I'm not telling you that I'm looking towards the under in a particular game, but if the total is a 52 and people are taking the over and the line obviously is dropping down because we're betting the under, maybe I think it's going to be 48, and that still could be a high total, and so there still could be a lot of fantasy points. Just because I think that a game might not go over doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's going to be low scoring. As you guys know, I look for value in the line. So if my number is 48 and the book is 52, that's a point total difference of 4 points, and that might register as a certain high strong play or a medium marker play. So at any rate, there are games, and the best way to keep track of the high scores and that sort of thing, the games that we really like, if you're not getting on those games, if you're not betting those games with us when we release it, is just by following the podcast, because Evan and I do a podcast every Friday night. We record a lot of information. That podcast goes live Saturday morning. completely free, and we're talking about some games, and I'll give sort of tips and tidbits and that sort of thing. So if you're really not betting on these games and you don't want to get the actual games for DFS, we might give some hints as to games that we think would be higher or lower scoring from the free content that I produce up on the podcast. It's called the Sharp Football Analysis Podcast. Yeah, thank you. Division rivals. Yeah, I mean, I know that's an angle. Familiarity breeds the ability to understand what this opponent is going to do. But I approach every game uniquely. I don't look at trends. I know this is something I talked with Evan Silva a lot about too. Far too often I think guys get hung up in trends. Trends in if this is the particular situation, then 65% of the time the game's going to go under. Well, that might be true, but guess what? A lot of things aren't factored into trends at all, such as player injuries or strategies or coaching changes or a lot of things like that. So it's very difficult to rely on trends. I just think that there's so much. I would spend the time that you're focusing on trends, and I would allocate that to researching more about the players, what you think the coaches are going to do and call in a particular game, the play calls and that sort of thing. I just am very down on trends. I think it's a shortcut that a lot of people like to use, and they think that they've got this back-tested track record that X, Y, and Z is going to happen, but then they start using that trend and they move forward, and guess what? They're hitting like 52% if they're betting these games. And for DFS, they might have hits and misses along the way. And they're wondering why they're not making more money because they're using all these trends. And the issue is that trends aren't as predictive as you want. They might explain a lot of things that happened in the past, but you're not going to sacrifice using trends for hard work and dedication to actually breaking down the games yourself. You're going to have to do that. I focus a lot on offensive coordinator. I focus a lot on play calling. As you can see from the website, we do a lot about talk a lot about efficiency. We talk about personnel groupings and what teams should do and that sort of thing. So you have to approach it by two ways. The first way is you have to think what this team should do based on their opponent, based on their strengths, and based on just efficient football. And then you have to think of, unfortunately, what the coaches will do. And most of the time the coaches won't do the most efficient thing. So you sort of do have to handicap and understand coaches' strategies, coaches' trends. Maybe we'll ask Scott about that. That's a good question because I didn't catch the article, Active Play Callers by Efficiency. So that's a good question. Remind me, we'll make sure that we hit that after we talk about some of the other things with Scott. We're sort of going to break down games with Scott in much the same way we did with Evan Silva, because I think it's very important to get a good understanding from some of the professionals. Here's Scott right now. Scott.
Warren, what's going on?
Hey, buddy, how are you?
Good. Are we live right now?
We are live. Guys, can you hear Scott? I assume everybody can hear you, but they'll post some comments here in a second. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good, man. Just spent the last 3 weeks in isolation analyzing play caller data through a fantasy lens. But it's completely taken over my life in that time.
Nice. Well, yeah, we're definitely going to ask you a few questions about that here today. And the other thing that we're going to do, guys, just so you guys know, we should have been doing it the last few Periscopes, but I'm going to pick randomly two people that retweet this. Two people that retweet it are going to get electronic version of the 2017 football preview. So tonight, I'll look at everybody who retweeted it, and I'll give free copies. I'll contact you via DM. So if you want a copy, go ahead and retweet the Periscope to the rest of your followers. But so yeah, we're definitely gonna pick your brain with you being in isolation for a couple weeks over efficiency and play calling and that sort of thing. Let's go ahead. We got you on here because the season is right around the corner, and one of the things that we're focusing in with some of our experts, some of the pros that are calling in here, is trying to get a good understanding of you've seen a couple weeks of the preseason. You've also seen all of the offseason and the movement. And there might be some opinions that have changed from when you first started contemplating the season back in March or April, heading into the draft, even then after the draft, and up through right now. So what I want to do is try to get a good understanding from you, and the listeners can chime in, about an overrated team, an underrated team, an overrated player, an underrated player, not based on what we thought back in May or back in June, but what we think right now after a couple weeks of the preseason. If your opinion has changed, if your viewpoint has changed at all on what the current ADPs are going for, what the current teams as they're being discussed in social media or on ESPN or any of those stations. So that's what we're going to hit today, and then we're going to tackle at the end, we're going to tackle your article that you just put out, and I'll go ahead and retweet that after I get off this show so that everybody else can check out this article. But Scott, let's go ahead and start with a team that you think is going to be overrated this year. May not live up to expectations, for whatever those expectations currently are, whether it's in the DFS marketplace, people are high on a lot of these guys, but you don't think they're going to hit that mark, or you think they're going to lose more games than they're forecasted by Vegas, and therefore going to be in negative game script a lot more than people probably think.
Yeah, Warren, I'm sorry. I just want to peel back for just a second and compliment you first on your mustache. Fantastic mustache. And second,
thank you, sir.
I wanted to say to any of my followers who might just be tuning in, yeah, you're going to want to retweet this. You want a chance at Warren's book. It is phenomenal. I spent the following 3 days in a state of depression because of how good it was, and the fact that you did that on your own. Definitely check it out. It's great. If you don't win, buy it. It's worth it, I promise you. But yeah, going back to so I guess my top underrated team, or
yeah.
Starting off with overrated?
Yeah, overrated. Let's talk about the team that you think won't live up to the hype.
All right, so yeah, you're talking guys I think now. I really don't weight preseason very highly in a lot of my analysis, which I'm like watching players, let's say. But one team that I've completely soured on is the Colts, and I didn't think we would. We both did the same study. We found they have a super easy strength of schedule this season. Their win projection seems modest. 9 wins. We won 8 last year. Only 1 game over 500. Quarterback is the most important position in the league, and the Colts have easily one of the best. But the thing is, that quarterback is now hurt. He's questionable for week 1. Could be out as many as the first 3 weeks of the season. And then outside of quarterback, that roster talent is just really, really weak. If football games are won in the trenches, like we hear a lot of analysts say, then the Colts are screwed. They ranked last in pressures per game and pressures per dropback last season on their defense, on the defensive side. And the next worst team wasn't even close. They were just the worst at generating pressure by a substantial degree. And then on the offensive side of the ball, they ranked worst in pass blocking efficiency. We had our 5th lowest graded running game. They stunk in pass coverage as well, 3rd worst graded team in pass coverage. And you just look at the overall roster talent. They're starting 3 rookies on defense. They only have 1 starting defender to grade out above average. That's their strong safety Gathers. On offense, they had 4 starters who graded out poor, only 3 grading out above average, and that's the guys you expect. T.Y. Hilton, Andrew Luck. Their left tackle was slightly above average. Andrew Luck coming in at elite. T.Y. Hilton well above average. But just in terms of roster talent, I don't really know how we do it, especially with Andrew Luck's health so questionable.
Yeah, I won't disagree. I think, there are a number of teams who have really good quarterbacks, but there aren't really any team that has to rely on that quarterback as much as they do. When you talk about the drop-off from Luck to the backup, when you talk about how that team is built, Andrew Luck has to drive that ship. And the Packers with Aaron Rodgers are a little bit that way to an extent, but for some years they had Dom Capers and their defense was a little bit better. In Indianapolis, they lost their starting center, and they're just going to have to rely a lot on Andrew Luck this year. If he's not healthy, it will definitely be a problem. So let's parlay that into discussing real quick before we jump to the team that you think is underrated. I think that the move that they made with the GM is going to be positive for them long term. Obviously, it takes a little bit of time to restock a team and bring on the type of players that you want to be able to win games with. And I think that they're headed the right direction right now once they got rid of Grigson. What do you think of their current defense in general? I know they added some pieces there, and you mentioned a lot of the problems that they had last year. How do you project this defense in the 2017 season in terms of being able to improve over what they did last year in such a manner that they can, if Luck is not 100%, they could possibly rely a little bit more on the run game? Because obviously if they are losing because their defense is terrible, they're going to have to throw the ball with whatever quarterback they've got. So ideally, they don't want to be in those positions. They want to be in one-score games if they're not winning, so they can still lean a little bit more on the run game. How do you forecast their defense this year in terms of pieces they've added or severe deficiencies?
Like I said, it's not a good defense. They're starting 3 rookies. I like Malik Hooker, but he struggled he was one of our worst defenders in tackling efficiency last season, but he's a ball hawk. They only have one starting defender to grade out above average. That's so bad. You said lie on the running game, but Frank Gore is 34 years old, and that offensive line is not good, and they just lost their center. And just to bring it back to Andrew Luck for a second, we've seen him play hurt before in 2015, and he was our second worst graded quarterback. He graded out worse than Johnny Manziel, Nick Foles, only higher than Colin Kaepernick. Definitely some major concerns there. I think that defense is going to be one that's going to get brutalized frequently in terms of fantasy.
Right. Yeah, I won't disagree with you at all on that one. I think it's difficult for Colts fans to have to deal with a quarterback who's as important being injured, but that's the situation that they're in, and we'll see how they do this year. What is a team that you think is being underrated, whether it's by the Vegas betting markets, whether it's in social media, people not talking enough about this particular team that you think is going to do better this year than what most people think, and in addition, that might provide maybe better game scripts for them if they so desire?
I think that the Chargers, Mike Clay's talked about them a lot, but judging by at least my followers, people are still super, super low on them. I think it's a good team, a great roster talent. They just suffered from some crazy, crazy bad luck last year. They lost a lot of guys to injuries: Danny Woodhead, Keenan Allen, Stevie Johnson, Brandon Flowers, Jason Barrett, Jaleel Adai, Brandon Bain, Manny Teo, Melvin Gordon. All those guys are starters. But still, the team led 40% of the time last year. That's 10th most. They blew 6 leads in the fourth quarter. That's crazy unlucky. They were 1-8 in one-score games. They're still dealing with some bad injury luck. Forrest Lamp, who PFF was crazy, crazy high on, he's out for the year. He was the highest-rated guard in the class. Chargers took him in round 2. Mike Williams, he's still on the PUP. Denzel Perryman out 8 to 10 weeks. So definitely still some bad injury luck there, but the roster talent is still very exciting. Russell Okung's probably a slight upgrade on King Dunlap. Dan Feeney, the guard in the 3rd round, was our 3rd highest rated guard in the class. Hopefully he can step up for in Lance offense. We have arguably like one of the best, 2 of the best edge rushers in the league. Both Bosa and Melvin Ingram graded out top 6 among edge rushers last year. And Bosa was just a rookie. Really put together an incredible season we haven't seen since J.J. Watt's early years in the league. And then the cornerbacks are fantastic, and Hayward and Barrett. Barrett was our 7th highest rated cornerback 2 seasons ago, before he was hurt last year. Hayward was our 6th highest graded cornerback last year. There's the emergence of Hunter Henry, who put together one of the best rookie tight end season since Rob Gronkowski and Aaron Hernandez, at least as a receiver, racked up a crazy high amount of first downs given his target total. The offensive line is still a tad suspect, but I see strengths everywhere else. We just need to stay healthy. And like I said, it's just been really bad luck there. Football Outsiders has had them ranked among the bottom 7 in adjusted games lost due to injury in each of the last 4 years. But if these stay healthy, I see big things on the horizon for this team.
Yeah, I was definitely disappointed when I saw Lamp go down. I mean, I know how important that is for an older quarterback like Phillip Rivers to have a reliable line, and I was optimistic about him as well. And it frustrated me with the lack of the knee brace. I know some teams wear them all the time, and he obviously wasn't wearing them. I know they're not going to ensure that you don't get hurt, but as a preventative measure, especially in practice in the preseason, I'm certainly no team physician, but it just seems like when some of the better offensive lines and some of the smarter teams are using it, that most of the teams should try to use it as well. What is your take? And I like the Chargers too. I really do. I agree with some of the comments here that we're getting on the Periscope about the defense. I think the defense is, the defense was so bad for a number of years, and they really definitely turned the corner. Literally, they've got some cornerbacks there that are really strong, and I love the edge rushers like you mentioned. So I'm big on their defense as well. Talk a little bit about Melvin Gordon and what you think of his, I don't know his ceiling, but just his outlook this upcoming season. How do you think he's going to perform? Might he exceed expectations from an ADP perspective? If we think that the Chargers are going to do better than what most people think, theoretically that would mean the run game should also do better because they'll have more opportunities to run the ball if they're leading more. What's your take on Melvin Gordon?
Yeah, so early in the season, Melvin Gordon was one of my guys. He was one of my favorite guys. We heard a lot of people talk about how his touchdown rate was unsustainable last year, but I was just looking at that roster, and I was saying, no, I think this is going to be one of the best. This looks like one of the best offenses on paper, at least. I think he's going to continue to rack up touchdowns. He was used in this crazy bell cow manner last season. He was on pace for 335 carries, 71 targets prior to his Week 14 injury. Only David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell were beating that. No one else was really coming close to that. So I was super, super high on him. And then I looked at these play caller trends, and there's a shift in coaching there. Ken Wisenhunt is now calling offensive plays, and we have a 5-year sample of him calling offensive plays. And during that time, his running backs ranked 7th worst in weighted opportunity percentage, 7th worst in weighted opportunity per season, and 5th worst in fantasy points per game among all 29 active play callers with at least 1 year of experience. So weighted opportunity is just this number I came up with that assigns the actual value to carries and targets based on average fantasy points per target and average fantasy points per carry among all running backs. This is over a 5-year sample, the most recent 5-year sample. So basically what it's saying is Ken Wisenhunt's running backs have underperformed, and we haven't seen really this valuable workload, and he kind of prefers more of a running back committee approach than the straight bell cow kind of season we saw from Gordon last year. And all beat writer comments have been backing this up. ESPN beat writer Eric Williams for the Chargers has said the team doesn't want Melvin Gordon around 300 carries. Again, he was on pace for 335 last year, 71 targets. Wisenhunt's RB1s historically have averaged only 205 carries and 49 targets per season. Just looking at the roster depth, it's hard to imagine Kenneth Barrow, Kenjon Barner, Brandon Oliver, Andre Williams eating into his touches. But I'm buying into these play calling tendencies, and I'm definitely more pessimistic than I was just a few months ago.
Yeah, that's interesting. Extremely good analysis. I was a little bit down on Melvin Gordon just from his overall performance. His productivity, his average yards per carry over his first couple years obviously leaves a lot to be desired. the thing that he has going for him, or at least he had last season, was definitely going for him, was just the volume. I mean, the amount of volume that he was getting, but in terms of his efficiency and productivity, it was not nearly as strong. So
exactly.
I'm more pessimistic on him than a lot of people are from the perspective of performance, but from the perspective of fantasy, me personally, I think he's going to be adequate because they are going to have to be a little bit balanced there. So let's move on to some players. Let's move on to discussing one of your most overrated players based on ADP or what's being discussed right now. I know you mentioned the Colts, but who's a player that you think is just being drafted way too high or people have too high of an opinion of right now?
I could probably name a few guys, but the one I've been getting the most heat on Twitter is how down I am on Devante Freeman. And I think this goes back to a lot of my play caller work, but mostly just the fact that I'm like Kyle Shanahan's biggest fanboy. I just think he's this brilliant offensive mastermind, the likes of which we haven't really seen outside of like a Bill Belichick. Huge, tremendous fan of him. And we look at Atlanta last season, how much they overperformed by. This was one of the greatest offenses all time, arguably. Last season, they averaged 6.69 yards per offensive play. That's the fourth best since 1960. The team scored 540 total points. That's eighth best since 1960. They turned the ball over only 11 times last season, which ranks third fewest since 1960. This offense was phenomenal. It was due for some regression regardless, but when you're changing from Kyle Shanahan as play caller to Steve Sarkisian, who has never done it on the NFL level, I think they're going to take a big step back, and that's what Devante Freeman completely relied on last season is efficiency. And we were talking about this a little bit with Melvin Gordon, but with running backs, I don't look too much at efficiency, except to kind of calculate regression. I've done studies on this. You can find my work on bell cow running backs. The running back position is super heavily tied to volume, snaps, being on the field. And Devante Freeman's stuck in a committee with Kevin Coleman, and he's being drafted as the sixth running back off the board. I think he has really low upside if Coleman stays healthy all season. And, I've just been avoiding him like the plague.
Yeah, I mean, that offense, obviously one of the big things that offense did last year was how aggressive they stayed in the first half, and their desire to just dial up it's very difficult to do this, but to dial up these chunk plays repeatedly. I don't necessarily mean like 20-play games, though they had that, but consistent, 5 to 7 yard gains so that they can keep moving the ball down the field, keep bypassing third downs, and just staying aggressive all first half. I don't know if Sarkisian is going to approach it with that same level of importance that it's important for us to get out to as big of a lead as we can at halftime, which is basically, all teams want to try to lead at halftime and want to win the game by 100 points each week, but the Falcons were so determined to push the pace even with a lead and to keep the pedal on the gas to go into halftime with a massive lead, and then that allowed the run game to kind of take over a little bit more in the second half if necessary. If they don't have such big leads, if the opponent is in games, they might be passing the ball a little bit more in the second half. And in addition, I agree with you. The efficiency from Freeman was ridiculous. The productivity from Freeman was tremendous. What do you think of the Falcons' defense, flipping it onto the other side of the ball real quick? Do you think that we're going to see, obviously they're going to get a little bit healthier at cornerback, but do you think that unit is going to be stronger such that they, even if they're slightly less efficient offensively and slightly worse play calls from the quarterback, from the offensive coordinator, that they would be able to still be better because the defense is much more improved? Or do you think that the defense is going to be pretty similar to what we saw last season?
I think we can take a slight step up. I like the addition of Poe. But there's really not too many people who stand out on defense. Their free safety, their linebacker Jones, were the two graded out above average last season. Everyone else was at perfectly average or below average. I see it being better, but I don't see it being better enough to justify Devonta Freeman's current average draft position.
Right, okay. Perfect. Well, now let's talk about a player that you are you think is being overlooked, that whether you've drafted him personally a lot or you just think that he is being overlooked by the masses, that enough people aren't talking about him right now. What's that player to you that stands out the most?
I get asked this question a lot on podcasts, and everyone always hates my answer because it's always going to be some guy drafted being really late with like low upside. But it's Kenny Britt, who just has, if you just contrast what he did last year versus his current ADP, his ADP makes no sense. He's being drafted as the 50th wide receiver off the board. He finished 27th at the position last season. That's one of the highest differentials just in terms of production last season versus ADP this season. I mean, it's really phenomenal if you look at the different things stacked against him. He had arguably the toughest quarterback schedule in the league last year. He ran 35.7% of his routes against top 25 graded quarterbacks. That was the highest rate in the league last year. He had the worst quarterback situation in the league. Collectively, Rams quarterbacks averaged a passer rating of 70.4. Yet, when targeting Britt, the average of passer rating 96.2. That's the largest positive differential for all wide receivers last season. Again, strength of schedule is a concern. Quarterback play is still a concern. But it's encouraging to know he's risen above it, and I just don't see much target competition there. All tight ends in the Browns roster combined to amass only 12 career receptions. Corey Coleman is the only receiver on the roster with more than 20 career receptions, and he struggled last year, ranked bottom 20 in yards per route run, wide receiver rating, yards per target average. He had only 3 receptions and 25 or more yards last year. That ranks 73rd among wide receivers, and all 3 of those plays came against 2 of PFF's bottom 20 graded cornerbacks. So just in terms of how efficient he was last year compared to his cornerback schedule, compared to the quarterbacks who was throwing the ball, and then the different receiving talents on the Browns roster, I think he's such a safe bet to beat out his ADP of wide receiver 50 when he finished 27th last year.
So what do you
in 15 games?
Yeah. Now, what do you think of Kaiser at quarterback? Do you think that you've seen, I don't know, I think at the beginning, correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't weigh what you see in the preseason all that much, at least you haven't yet, or obviously we've seen a little bit of Kaiser in the preseason. If you haven't weighed that, that's fine, we can pass on the question, but if you have been watching him in the preseason, do you think that they believe when do you think he might be ready to go in there, and what do you think is in the Browns' best interest from a quarterback perspective in terms of what they should do this season and when they should do that?
They're not in contention, so why would you be starting Brock Osweiler? Why would you be starting maybe Kessler, who PFF thinks is the better quarterback, but probably lacks long-term upside? Definitely makes a lot of sense just throwing the rookie in there, seeing what he can do. Maybe waiting a few weeks, get a little bit more experience, have him kind of watch. But his PFF grade hasn't been great. I know there's been a ton of hype surrounding him, but we have him graded below average this preseason. And again, all of these quarterbacks are not going to be good, but I think Britt's going to see the targets and the volume to return value at his current ADP.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I mean, what we've seen a lot, and I talk about this often when we're talking about young quarterbacks, is window of opportunity for teams to see success actually is in the quarterback's younger years, before they get that second deal where, unless you're Tom Brady and you're only taking a $14 million cap hit, which is QB 20, most of these quarterbacks, when they get to be actually good, are breaking a team's bank and they're having to struggle to balance their salary for the rest of the roster. Then they end up inevitably losing a key receiver, losing some defensive strength. And the window is actually in the quarterback's second and third season in general. So my opinion is they're not going to do much this year with or without Kaiser. Get him in there so that you can see what you've got, as much experience as possible, so that by the time that you get into his second and third years, you've built up the defense a little bit, surrounded him with a little bit more talent. They can actually be a competitive team poised to make a run if they decide to go with him. And if they decide that they're not going to be able to go with him, that should be based upon what he's been doing in games, competitive games, not what he's doing in practice or in preseason. So I personally am never in favor of, unless he's completely not ready. If you're taking a quarterback as high as they took Kaiser, I want to get him in there, especially with a team like the Browns. I could see a little bit more with Alex Smith and the Chiefs, because yes, I think Mahomes, maybe if he's perfect, offers bigger upside than Alex Smith in terms of his ability to create in the offense. Alex Smith is proven, and you're not going to bench Alex Smith when you still have a shot at making the playoffs and double-digit wins. So that's a little bit different. But when you're talking about a guy like Kaiser, I'm down on Brock. Kessler could have some upside, but I want to see what Kaiser brings to the table personally. So with all that said, let's talk briefly before we let you go about this article that you just put out. I didn't catch it yesterday. I'm going to retweet it. Tell everybody a little bit about the article and what some of your key findings were.
Well, it hasn't come out yet, but I
Okay.
did post like 6 different charts analyzing play caller tendencies. You can find that on my timeline right now. Articles should be out either later this week or next week. Pretty much what I did was I looked at every single active play caller, and that's not offensive coordinator. That's the guy actually calling the offensive plays. I looked at their history over the past decade. Only in full seasons they were calling plays, and I broke it down by fantasy points per game at each position, target market share, targets per season. Running backs, I looked at weighted opportunity, RB1 versus RB2, so you can see which guys prefer committee approaches, which guys prefer bell cows. And how I did that was I looked at each, let's say, wide receiver 1, RB1. Those guys were whoever led the team in opportunities per game that season. And then if, let's say, an RB1 goes down with an injury, that RB2 then slides into the RB1 designation. So you just really see how guys use their players, how they target them, the kind of volume you see. And then I just wrote up a quick, maybe like 500 words, 1,000 words, maybe like 400 words of analysis on each team. Different guys, I think here's what we can learn from the different play callers. Guys with like 1 or 2 years of experience. I'm not going too in depth on that, but guys with like 10 years of experience, let's say Bruce Arians, we kind of know what we want to expect. His wide receiver 2s over the past decade have averaged 20.1% of the team's targets. That ranks most among active play callers, and that's not far removed from his wide receiver 1's average, which is 24.7. So if we want to take him at his word that Jerron Brown is the team's new wide receiver 2, that's an immense opportunity and value for him because he's currently going undrafted in most drafts.
Interesting. So you're going to put all this together in an article. When do you think that's coming out?
Either later this week or early next week.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll be on the lookout for that. That's obviously fascinating. It's incredibly relevant to try to understand what play callers like to do. And I realize that from time to time, and it changes based on what their weapons are and that sort of thing. But doing a little bit of research, whether it helps a ton or even if it just helps a little, every edge in such a competitive industry is going to help. So that is interesting. We're going to take a couple of questions for Scott. This is Scott Barrett of PFF, a Pro Football Focus. You can follow Scott on Twitter. We didn't introduce you with your Twitter handle before. It's at Scott Barrett DFB. So you can follow him on Twitter at Scott Barrett DFB. And first question up, guys. You can fire away some of your questions for Scott. First question up, Scott. Any list of, you got a couple of secondaries that you think are in trouble this year? It doesn't have to be like the number 1 and number 2 most in trouble, but if you could think of a couple that are in trouble this upcoming season, Who would you say?
I don't know. I'm better at answering maybe like the better cornerbacks secondaries this season. I like
go ahead and give us
Denver, Giants, Minnesota definitely stands out. Arizona getting Tyrann Mathieu back. I like Budda Baker a lot. Teams San Diego I talked about before as well. Oakland's the secondary I can see struggling again this season. I don't know. I haven't done too much research into cornerbacks on the team level yet.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? I didn't see the last couple that popped up. Devante Parker. Do you have a realistic outcome for Devante Parker? Any prediction on what you think Devante Parker is going to do in that offense?
Yeah, I don't really have too many good stats to back this up just because, he struggled last season relative to expectations, relative to what Jarvis Landry was able to accomplish. But we have to remember that we have a new quarterback this season, Jay Cutler, who's, a lot more carefree with the ball in his hands. He likes to target those receivers deep. I think he compared Parker to Alshon Jeffrey this season. Throughout his career, Cutler was never one to really target guys short over the middle with like those low A-dot targets. He likes to hit those guys deep. So I think the move from Ryan Tannehill to Jay Cutler is just, I moved him up in my rankings and I moved Jarvis Landry down in my rankings earlier today. So yeah, definitely more excited about his prospects this season regarding the coaching change. But we have to remember this is a slow-paced offense, ranked last in the league last year in offensive plays per game and pass attempts. And he wanted to give Jay the ball as much as possible, and I don't blame them. So maybe his upside isn't crazy high, but it's definitely a lot better. It's a lot better now with Jay Cutler in the setup.
Right. Michael Thomas, strength of schedule. Even with his strength of schedule, do you feel he can be successful? We'll do one more after that, guys. I already wrote it down. But hit this one, and then we'll got one more, and we'll let you go. What do you think about Michael Thomas? Do you think he'll be successful in this offense? I know a lot of people are, obviously high on Snead and think he can do a lot, maybe exceed his ADP. But it's almost as if, at least to me, and you might be more plugged in, but it seems to me a lot of people aren't even talking as much about Michael Thomas. They're focusing on Snead, and I'm of course big on Ted Ginn and the fact that we talked about this with Evan yesterday about the weakness of that defense and how Ginn's never been on a team where the defense was that bad, where the offense is going to have to score as much as they'll need to. So it seems to me, from what I've heard, that Michael Thomas isn't getting as much discussion. But the question was about, despite and ignoring his strength of schedule, or including it, factoring in his strength of schedule, what do you think about Michael Thomas this year?
So I just want to say I'm with you on Ginn. I think his ADP is really bad compared to at least where I have him ranked and where our projections have him. I think there's a massive opportunity for him. In regard to strength of schedule, I've written about this a few times in various articles. Like last season, I looked at expected fantasy points per target based on each wide receiver's cornerback schedule last season. And he had one of the weaker ones where Brandon Cooks came in much higher. So now Michael Thomas is going to be picking up those CB1s on opposing defenses. So his strength of schedule gets a little bit tougher. He wasn't very efficient against highly ranked quarterbacks last season. So maybe we could expect a slight regression there. And meanwhile, Willie Snead had one of the 5 toughest quarterback schedules for slot wide receivers, and this season he has one of the 5 easiest, so we should expect some positive regression for him. But I think my main concern for Michael Thomas is that a lot of people are just I think his ADP is fine, but a lot of people are projecting he takes this massive leap this season. But looking back at my play caller data, among all active play callers with at least 1 year of experience, no one has targeted their wide receiver 1 less frequently than Sean Payton. He's never had a wide receiver on pace for at least 140 targets over the past 8 seasons, though 14 different wide receivers were on pace to reach that number last season.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Well, the last question. Somebody mentioned this earlier a couple different times, so they must be really curious about this. Your opinion on other analysts saying that wide receiver cornerback matchups aren't as predictive. I don't know I'm not exactly sure what that is necessarily about, but do you have an opinion on people suggesting that wide receiver cornerback matchups aren't as predictive? Obviously, for me personally, if I know that a cornerback is going to be matched up on a wide receiver number 2 or wide receiver number 1, it depends on the style of that defense. I'm going to take that into consideration as I factor in. It's not going to be the first and foremost thing that I look at in a game, but it's definitely going to be something that I consider when I'm looking at how the offense versus the defense and the game flow and the predicted game script that I'm going to see in this game. I'm certainly going to get down to the level of factoring in who he's matching up against as a cornerback. So what's your take on that question?
Yeah, I'm all about wide receiver versus cornerback data and analyzing the different matchups. You can listen to my podcast I did with Evan Silva on the Feast a couple weeks back, or the one I did with Adam Leviton on the Edge podcast to hear my full range of thoughts. But yeah, I think it's probably the most exploitable edge we have in DFS right now, because when they're doing salaries for players, they're not looking at the opposing cornerback that receiver is going to spend the majority of their routes against. They're looking at it on a team basis. So it's getting the average of different wide receivers. And it's tough to really analyze it because it's not always relevant. It really isn't. Some guys move all around the line of scrimmage, maybe 33% of their routes in the slot, 33 left wide receiver, 33 right wide receiver. So they're going to see a bunch of different cornerbacks. But at the extremes, when we know a guy is going to be shadowed, when we know a guy sticks to his side 70% of the time against a cornerback who typically sticks to his side, that's huge. And again, I'm only if it's Odell Beckham Jr. against a top cornerback, I'm not going to weight it too highly. But when it's a middling receiver talent versus one of the worst cornerbacks in the league, that's huge. A top wide receiver versus one of the worst cornerbacks in the league, that's huge. Middling wide receiver against one of the top 20 cornerbacks in the league, that is huge. So big fan of that data. Check out my articles during the season. Check out some of the work I've done during the off season on this. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of it. I think sometimes what you have with people knocking it, and I've gotten that a lot, is just that that's a PFF exclusive package is access to data. So I think you could see some people just kind of knocking it because they don't have access to that information.
I've found similar to what you have, but not on a cornerback versus wide receiver, but just in strength of schedule in general. People ask, how much should you weight strength of schedule? And I have definitely found that, let's say you're talking about the Atlanta Falcons and in the offense that they had last year. If they're playing a tough defense, offense was playing a really difficult defense. It's the matchups where you've got like Odell Beckham or another great player. I don't think the strength of that, the guy's still going to get targeted a lot and he's still going to be effective. And I think for teams as well, you got a great offense, they're still going to be productive. They may not be productive as they were when they play the Browns or another team, last season, but they're still going to be somewhat productive. I'm not going to completely shy away from them. But when you have this player or team that's struggling a little bit, and then the strength of schedule is really bad against them, that's when I think you have to take a little bit more notice of it. So I would agree with that for sure. I'll go ahead and let you run, Scott. We really appreciated you joining us today. Great information. Remember, guys, you can follow him at Scott Barrett DFB. So thanks again, Scott.
Thanks, Warren. Had a lot of fun.
All right, perfect. All right, guys. So that was Scott. Again, remind you guys, go ahead. If you want a chance, I'll give out 2 magazines tonight. So retweet this at any point. It doesn't have to be during the show. Obviously, this just people can play it from behind anyways at any point in time. Win total projections changed a lot. I wouldn't say a lot, but there have been some teams that I've gotten a little bit more optimistic on or a little bit more pessimistic on. Actually, within the next probably 24 hours, once crack lands in Vegas, and we're going to start putting out a couple of games here already for week 1. So we're already started focusing. I know the preseason is the big thing now, especially week 3 coming up, but we're going to start. We're starting to work on week 1 already. So be on the lookout for some of that. And otherwise, if there's any other couple of questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, we'll pick back up tomorrow. Later this week, we've got Brad Evans is going to be involved. Brad Evans from Yahoo is going to be on the show later this week. EDSR predictive on a game-to-game level. I missed part of that question, but yes, EDSR is absolutely predictive. EDSR is the most correlated stat to wins and losses other than turnovers, and at least that I've found. You know, obviously I kind of created EDSR. It's early down success rate. It's custom analytic that I use and nobody else uses, but it's more correlated to wins than anything besides turnovers. But turnovers are obviously very difficult to predict. I've come up with some models that model out predictively EDSR and strengths and weaknesses for that in an upcoming week. So yes, I definitely look at EDSR on a weekly basis predictively. Absolutely. Any other questions before I run back to I don't know if we're going to the pool next or the beach, but I'm hitting the water some form or fashion. What do you guys got? All right, if there's Vikings win total, I like the Vikings. I'm big on the Vikings. Ironically, though, I think people are a little bit too low on the Bears. I kind of agree with Evan. I'm a little bit lower than other people on the Lions, but it's not that I'm low on all the teams in that division. I still think the Bears are going to probably exceed some people's expectations, but I love the matchups and I love the strength of schedule for the Vikings, and I love the fact that, I mean, let's just consider Sam Bradford. This was in my magazine, so if you're hearing it for the second time, I apologize, but Sam Bradford last season went from the Philadelphia Eagles, a completely different offense, a completely different team, up to the Minnesota Vikings just a few weeks before the start of the season. He starts the season with Norv Turner. Norv Turner obviously terrible. He obviously loses Adrian Peterson. Norv Turner then gets fired. So they're dealing with an offensive coordinator change that he was just becoming accustomed to dealing with. Then he's trying to adjust to this new offensive coordinator behind the most injured offensive line in the NFL, and by the way, going up against the best pass rushing defensive lines in the NFL. I mean, the deck was completely stacked against Sam Bradford last year, and by the way, his coach was dealing with retina issues and missed some games and practices and that sort of thing. So it was just a horrible, you almost couldn't write a worse type of story for success than what they were dealing with the Minnesota Vikings. So I am very big on the potential that they could get a healthy Stephon Diggs and Thielen running in tandem. Kyle Rudolph is a beast. I'm definitely big on Dalvin Cook as well. I wish the offensive line was slightly better, but they're better than what they were last year. Hopefully their injury situation goes all right. So yeah, I do like the Minnesota Vikings this year. All right, guys, last question here. Run defenses that have gotten weaker to pick on in DFS early. Run defenses. I'm drawing a blank. I don't really know of run defenses that I think have gotten worse throughout the course of the preseason that I think are going to be bad compared to last year. But I will tell you this: a lot of people, strength of schedule. The question mark still is strength of schedule predictive? Can you use that from one year over the next? And I've done a lot of analytics on that, and I've determined that strength of schedule is in fact predictive. some of the metrics are less predictive than others. Like at the site, at Sharp Football Stats, I show you strength of schedule for all different types of positions. Running back strength of schedule, receiver strength of schedule, quarterback pass rush opposing strength of schedule, the ability to throw the ball to running back strength of schedule. So there's a lot of strength of schedules there that maybe some of them are less predictive than others. I think the key, obviously, if you're talking DFS, which I think the question related to DFS, one of the edges that a lot of people don't do enough in DFS and across the media is they don't focus on strength of schedule in season, which is far more predictive as compared to strength of schedule in the off season and forecasting what you think a team is going to do from last year. When you get 3-4 weeks of data on a team, you can get some very good predictive abilities to understand the strengths and weaknesses of this team. And if you can start looking at players, greetings, Turkey. How are you doing over there? If you can get some strength of schedule data that other people aren't analyzing as much, it's going to be very helpful for you. Both from like picking up guys off of waivers to figuring out who you want to play on a week-to-week basis. Because first of all, nobody's looking at, for instance, during the course of the season, hardly anybody is looking at the strength of schedule of deep passing or the strength of schedule of even defensive line production. They look at overall strength of schedule of a defense or an offense, but there is a big difference if you've gone up against a number of strong defensive lines and all of a sudden you've got a cupcake defensive line that you're going up against, that your quarterback might have a little bit more time to throw the football. And some people may just look at it from, just think about that on their own, but when you can look at it and see it measured out on sharpfootballstats.com and you can see how they rank compared to the rest of the NFL in terms of how difficult their first 4 weeks has been, that's very helpful. And in terms of, I think the question that just popped up was, do I look at 4 weeks or when do I start looking at that? Obviously, the first 2 weeks or so are not very predictive, but I will start weighting it slightly, week 3 even, and I'll start looking at it there, understanding who they played. Obviously, you got 2 games worth of data in there, and I'm going to understand how they played. The Chiefs, that's one team where I headed into the offseason thinking they're going to be worse, but they've looked a little bit better to me. I'm not as warm on fading the Chiefs entirely this year, but I do think that they probably are going to struggle a little bit, and for reasons I explained in the book. I won't rehash them all here, but I do think that they could struggle more than some people think. I don't know that they're going to win 11, 12 games this upcoming season like they've been able to record double-digit wins in the past. But yeah, I do think, I wrote in the book about the defense. Somebody just asked a question about the Chiefs' defense. I do think that the defense is not going to perform quite as well as it did last season. And that coupled with the offense's inability potentially to get big plays. They've changed things up a little bit and done a little bit more trying to go downfield. They say that Alex Smith is getting a little bit more aggressive thanks to being pushed by Mahomes. Maybe that's true. We'll see how that plays into the games. And obviously 100%. That's what I was writing up in the book about the turnover data supporting the Chiefs stepping back to the pack a little bit this year. So, guys, really enjoyed it. We're going to do something exciting tomorrow on this Periscope again at 12:30 Eastern. And then on Thursday, we're going to be bringing on Brad Evans of yahoo.com. So check him out every single day. You'll be able to ask some questions. I'll try to answer some of them. And give this a retweet, and you'll go ahead and get a chance to win a free PDF magazine. So thanks again for tuning in. I appreciate the support, guys. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.